"Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" Captain Derek Holt said it with a smile, standing in the aisle of his own first-class cabin. His voice wrapped in the particular kind of courtesy that isn't courtesy at all, the kind that carries a question inside the question, the kind that means, "What exactly are you doing here?" Naomi. Ellison did not look up from her book right away. She let the words settle the way she had learned to let things settle, not from passivity, but from precision, the way you let a room go quiet before you decide what it needs to hear. She turned one page deliberately, and then she looked up at him with calm, brown eyes that gave nothing away, and said simply that she was fine, thank you. He moved on. She watched him go in her peripheral vision, the way she had been trained to watch things she was not supposed to be watching, with the part of her attention that never fully rests the part that has been awake and cataloging information since she boarded Liberty Cross, Flight 441 at Dulles International Airport 40 minutes ago, bound for London Heathrow in seat 4A. The first-class cabin of Liberty Cross Flight 441 was the kind of space that announces itself without raising its voice. Italian leather in a shade of cream that suggested money, without mentioning it overhead lighting warm enough to flatter, but cool enough to suggest efficiency. The distant clink of crystal as a flight attendant moved through the galley, preparing the pre-departure service with the quiet choreography of someone who has done this 10,000 times. Outside the oval window, the last light of a Washington evening was bleeding orange and violet across the tarmac, and the baggage carts moved through it like small, purposeful animals, indifferent to beauty. Naomi watched them for a moment, then let her gaze return to the page. She was reading Marcus Aurelius. She had carried the same copy of Meditations on every operation for 6 years, the spine cracked at the same passages, the margins populated with her own pencil markings, from 4 countries and 100 different waiting rooms, and the backs of surveillance vehicles, and once a bathtub in Prague, where she had spent 3 hours reading while a suspect she was monitoring slept on the other side of the wall. The book was not precious to her in a sentimental way. It was a tool. It reminded her that the mind is the only jurisdiction a person truly owns, and that everything else, the noise, the pressure, the weight of other people's assumptions, exists outside that boundary and cannot cross it without permission. 48 hours earlier, she had closed a 9-month undercover operation that dismantled a domestic financing network tied to a cyber-terrorism ring operating across 5 states. The names on the arrest warrants would not appear in any newspaper. The faces she had memorized from surveillance photographs would simply disappear from the monitors in a basement room at the FBI's Washington field office, and the people who slept soundly tonight because of what she had done would never know her name. She was flying to London to brief Allied intelligence on what came next. The encrypted drive in the interior pocket of her bag contained the operational file, and her concealed badge was tucked 2 inches below it, and none of this was visible from the outside. From the outside, she was simply a black woman in her mid-30s, sitting in seat 4A of a first-class cabin with a worn paperback in her hands, and that she had learned was its own kind of information to certain people. Her mother's voice came back to her sometimes in spaces like this, in spaces that were built for comfort, but that had a way of making certain people feel the discomfort of their own presence. Sometimes it's not what you carry. It's who decides you shouldn't be carrying it. Her mother had once been turned away from the admissions desk of a maternity ward in Baltimore, 9 months pregnant, because a receptionist looked at her and decided without checking a single file that her insurance was probably not real. She had stood at that desk in labor and been made to prove her right to be there while the contractions came and went like waves she was not permitted to acknowledge. That was the kind of memory that does not stay in the past. It moves forward with you. It lives in the body, somewhere between the ribs and the sternum, and it shapes the way you carry yourself in every room that was not built with you in mind, so that you enter those rooms anyway, and you sit down, and you do not apologize for taking up space. Naomi leaned back into the leather of seat 4A and turned another page. She was not a guest here. She was a rightful occupant. The distinction mattered in ways that were not always visible, but they were always real. He was small for his age, and he was trying very hard not to show how overwhelmed he was, which Naomi recognized immediately because she had spent a significant portion of her professional life learning to identify the precise physical language of someone performing composure they do not entirely feel. His name tag read Caleb, printed in large letters on a laminated card hung around his neck on a lanyard, the universal marker of an unaccompanied minor, a child flying alone for the first time, entrusted to the airline and to the goodwill of strangers. He was in seat 5, B1 row behind Naomi and across the aisle, and he sat with the particular stillness of someone who has been told many times by many adults to sit still and who is currently obeying that instruction while also being completely incapable of stopping his eyes from moving over everything in the cabin with the slow, systematic wonder of a person cataloging a world he has never been inside before. He ran one finger along the stitching of the armrest, the way you'd touch something in a museum carefully, reverently, as though it might object. He was 10 years old, and he had a spiral notebook on his lap, and he was drawing. Naomi noticed him the way she noticed most things, without turning her head, without giving any indication that she was noticing at all. Their eyes met briefly when she shifted in her seat and she gave him a small nod. Not the performative warmth adults often deploy at children as a kind of social obligation, but an acknowledgement between two people who understood that they were both in their different ways, outsiders in a room that had not been designed with either of them in mind. He blinked, and then he nodded back, and then he looked down at his notebook and kept drawing. Gail Foster, the lead flight attendant, late 40s, warm in the way that is real, rather than rehearsed with a name tag that had been worn long enough that the letters were slightly faded, crouched beside Caleb's seat and asked him if he needed anything, checked that his tag was legible, pointed out the call button and the emergency card, and the location of the lavatory with the patient, thorough kindness of someone who genuinely cared whether a 10-year-old was scared. Caleb told her he was fine and that he liked the seat. Gail told him she was glad and that he should press the button if he needed anything at all, and she touched his shoulder briefly in a way that was so naturally maternal that even Naomi felt it from 3 feet away. In the seats ahead and around the other first-class passengers arranged themselves into the familiar taxonomy of long-haul travel. Owen Hurst in seat 3. A 60-something, silver-haired, the kind of man whose suit was expensive in a way that suggested he had stopped noticing what things cost already. Signaling displeasure at something Gail had not yet done wrong, a woman in pearls whose name Naomi did not yet know who arranged a silk eye mask on the tray table beside her magazine with the focused precision of someone accustomed to making long-haul flights comfortable. A younger businessman 2 rows back who had not looked up from his laptop since boarding. They were all versions of the same thing people for whom first class was unremarkable expected simply the way things were, and that ordinariness itself was a kind of power. Caleb drew a picture of the cabin. Naomi could see from the angle that he had included her in it, a figure in seat 4. Something rectangular on her lap that was clearly meant to be a book. He had not drawn Owen Hurst. He had drawn what interested him, which was apparently the woman reading and the light on the window and the seam where the carpet met the base of the galley curtain. Children always drew what was actually there. Captain Derek Holt walked into the first-class cabin like a man returning to a room he owned, which in the functional sense he did. He was the commanding officer of this aircraft responsible for every soul aboard and every cubic foot of pressurized air they breathed, and he carried that authority in the architecture of his posture and the set of his platinum blonde hair, which was combed with a precision that suggested it was combed the same way every day and had been for 20 years. He was broad-shouldered, jaw-sharp, with the particular kind of physical confidence that belongs to men who have spent decades being the most certain person in any room they entered. His uniform was immaculate in the way that military discipline makes things immaculate not from vanity, but from the belief that appearance is a form of control. He worked the cabin like a politician at a fundraiser, and he was good at it, warm in the right places, witty in the right measure, touching an elbow here and leaning in for a quiet word there. He called Owen Hurst by name, without hesitation, because he had checked the manifest, and because men like Owen Hurst expected to be recognized. He shared a short laugh with the businessmen about something related to transatlantic scheduling. He nodded with easy familiarity at the woman in pearls. His social fluency with the passengers who matched his mental picture of this cabin was effortless and genuine in the way that fluency always is when you have been practicing it your entire professional life. When he reached Naomi's row, something changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone not trained to notice would have caught. But Naomi caught it the way she caught everything cleanly and completely. His smile did not drop. His stride did not break. But there was a half-second pause and a glance that lasted slightly longer than any of the others, and something behind his eyes that was not hostility, not yet, but was the specific expression of a man filing information, a way running a quiet internal calculation, categorizing what he saw and finding that the category did not immediately resolve. Young, black, alone. First class, no obvious connection to anyone I've already greeted. He passed her without speaking. The omission was louder than anything he could have said. Caleb from 5B watched the captain's progress through the cabin with his pencil slowing in his hand. He was not old enough to articulate what he had noticed, but he noticed it. The man with the pale, straight hair had said hello to every person in the front of the cabin except the woman who had nodded at him. Children notice these things. Adults have learned to explain them away. Holt paused at the galley to exchange a brief friendly word with Gale, his manner easy, collegial, the warmth of professional familiarity. But there was something underneath it that wasn't quite warmth, a kind of baseline authority that turned the friendliness slightly compulsory, a reminder of whose name was on the roster as the person in charge. The aircraft began to taxi. The cabin dimmed. Naomi opened her book and found the passage she had underlined on the flight to Tokyo, the one she returned to the most often. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. She did not know, as the plane accelerated and the lights of Washington fell away beneath them, just how completely the next several hours would test whether she believed it. The seatbelt sign clicked off somewhere over the Virginia coastline, and the first-class cabin settled into the specific padded quiet of a long-haul flight at cruising altitude, a quiet that is not really quiet at all, but a layered ambient hum of engines and recycled air, and the soft percussion of a service cart being organized in the galley, all of it combining into a kind of white noise that people who fly often learn to disappear inside of the way you can learn to sleep on a train. Gale moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who has memorized exactly how much space she has and exactly how to move through it without interrupting anyone's sense of privacy, which is a considerable skill in a space where the rows are 6 feet apart and everyone can hear everyone else breathe. She reached Naomi's row and offered the pre-dinner service with genuine warmth. Not the performance of warmth that some cabin crews deploy like a tool, but the real version, which is subtly different in the eyes if you know what to look for. Naomi asked for sparkling water with lime, and when she said thank you, Gale the flight attendant blinked, not in surprise at the name itself, because it was right there on her tag, but in the small surprise of being actually seen, actually acknowledged as a person, rather than a function which happened less often than it should have in this particular cabin. Something shifted in Gale's expression, barely perceptible, like a door opening half an inch, a new kind of attention, and with it, the early unspoken beginnings of loyalty. 3 seats ahead. Owen Hurst flagged Gale down without looking up from his phone, holding his empty glass sideways in the extended hand of a man who has never had to say, "Excuse me," to get service, because the service has always simply arrived. Gale went to him without changing her expression, and Naomi watched this and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because she had spent enough time in enough rooms to understand that the difference in how 2 people treat a service worker is among the most accurate measurements of character available to anyone paying attention. Caleb in 5B was still drawing. He had moved on from the cabin interior and was working on something that required close concentration. His tongue pressed lightly to his upper lip, his pencil moving in small, careful arcs. Naomi could see from the angle that it was a face rendered with the unself-conscious accuracy of a child who has not yet learned that portraits are supposed to be flattering. She wondered whose face it was. She would find out later, and it would matter more than she could have predicted. She returned to her book, but she was not fully reading. One layer of her attention stayed open and moving through the cabin the way it always did in any environment. She had not fully assessed a background process that cataloged and discarded and flagged with the trained, unhurried efficiency of a mind that had been doing this for a very long time. And what it flagged 10 minutes after the seatbelt sign went off was this. Holt had come back out of the cockpit. He moved through the cabin differently this time, still with authority, still with the ease of a man in his own house, but slower, more deliberate, and his eyes were tracking in a way that was specific rather than general, and the thing they were tracking was seat 4A. Naomi felt the quality of his attention the way you can feel weather before it arrives, a change in pressure, subtle and certain. She turned a page. She did not look up. She was not ready to look up yet. But she noted it, and she adjusted her calculations, and she understood with the particular clarity of experience that the flight had entered a new phase. He came to her row with his arms loosely crossed, which is the body language of authority attempting to appear casual, and he smiled the smile of a man who has decided that what he is about to say is perfectly reasonable, and he said that he was sorry to interrupt, but he just needed to do a quick verification. They'd had some issues recently with first-class seating assignments, mix-ups with the boarding system, that sort of thing, and if she wouldn't mind showing him her boarding pass again just to confirm everything was in order. The request was implausible on its face, and they both knew it, because boarding passes are scanned at the gate with electronic readers that produce records, and no airline captain has ever resolved a seating dispute by personally checking documents mid-flight and the phrasing. If she wouldn't mind was the particular phrasing you use when you have already decided that the other person does not get to mind. But Naomi recognized with the cold precision of someone who has interrogated a great many people in a great many circumstances that the fastest way through a situation is usually not around it, and so she closed her book, marking the page first deliberately in a way that communicated she would be returning to it, and reached into her bag and produced the boarding pass and handed it to him without a word. He studied it for longer than it required, which was approximately 4 seconds, given that her name and seat number were printed in large, clear type. He read her name aloud. Dr. Naomi Ellison, in a tone that lived in the ambiguous territory between skepticism and something approaching amusement, as though the title were a costume he wasn't sure she had the right to wear. And then he asked, still in that same carefully pleasant tone, what kind of doctor she was. She told him she was the kind who valued her privacy, and she said it without sharpness, without visible irritation, with the same, even unhurried quality she brought to everything, a precision that closed doors without slamming them. He handed the boarding pass back, but he did not leave, and he did not apologize for the interruption, and instead he lowered his voice by a half degree and adopted the tone of a man sharing a confidential concern, leaning in slightly as though offering her something useful. And he said that they'd had real problems lately with people using other passengers' credentials to access premium cabins. Reward points, purchased under false names, that sort of thing. Very sophisticated, very hard to catch without a manual check. He shook his head in a way that communicated that it was a shame, really, what people would do. The implication settled over the cabin, the way a change in cabin pressure settles gradually, then all at once, and it was felt before it was understood. A few passengers looked up. The businessman's fingers paused on his keyboard. The woman in pearls turned a page without reading it. In row 5, Caleb's pencil stopped moving entirely. He looked from the captain to the woman in seat 4A, and then back to the captain, and he held his notebook against his chest with both hands, the way you hold something when you sense that the world has just shifted under you, and you want to keep hold of what's yours. Naomi's breath was even. Her hands were in her lap. She reopened her book, and the page she found was not the page she had been reading, but she looked at it anyway because the alternative was to look at Derek Holt, and she was not going to give him that, not yet. Not until she chose to. Gale returned from the galley at the wrong moment and the right moment simultaneously wrong because she walked directly into the tail end of the exchange. Right because her presence as a witness meant that what had just occurred was no longer something that could be walked back with a smile and a smooth denial. She had heard enough. She set her tray down on the service counter with the careful control of someone managing a reaction they cannot afford to show in front of a superior. And her eyes moved to Naomi's row with an expression that was not quite pity. Naomi would not have accepted pity, but was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a woman who has spent decades in service environments watching other women be told in language that was always technically polite that their presence required more justification than everyone else's. Owen, Hurst in 3. A made a sound quiet, private, designed to be deniable if anyone called him on it, a short exhale through the nose that landed somewhere between amusement and approval. The sound of a man who has just seen the natural order of things reaffirmed and found it satisfying. He picked up his bourbon glass. He did not look at Naomi. He had not looked at her directly since she boarded. The woman in pearls studied the back of the seat in front of her. The businessman closed a browser tab he had been reading. The cabin did not erupt into anything dramatic. It did the opposite. It contracted. It became more careful, as though everyone had simultaneously decided that the best strategy was to take up less space until the situation resolved, which is the specific collective behavior of witnesses who are aware they are witnesses and are not certain they want to be. Naomi noted every reaction without moving her head, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything, not with judgment, or not primarily, but with the professional attention of someone who understands that the way people respond to a situation tells you more about them than anything they choose to say. And what she was seeing was a room full of people who knew what was happening and had chosen, at least for now, to allow it. Caleb had set his pencil down entirely. He was watching Naomi with the complete, uncomplicated attention that children give to things they know are important, but don't yet have the vocabulary to describe the fixed, serious focus of a child who understands that something is wrong without being able to name it, which is its own kind of knowledge, perhaps a purer kind because it has not yet been smoothed over by adult explanations and social convenience. His notebook was still pressed against his chest. On the page he had been working on half-finished was a drawing of the first-class cabin from the angle of seat 5B, and in the center of it, in seat 4A, was a woman with a book in her hands, and standing over her was a figure with very straight pale hair. Somewhere in the background of her awareness, beneath the measured calm she wore as naturally as other people wear their faces, Naomi heard her instructor's voice from a lecture hall at Quantico a decade ago, making the point that he would make 3 more times before the semester ended, because it was the point worth making. Real power never needs to announce itself, but it knows precisely when the moment to stand has arrived. She turned another page. That moment was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather. He came back 20 minutes later, and this time the professional courtesy was thinner still present, because men like Derek Holt do not easily abandon the performance of reasonableness, but thinner in the way that a veneer gets thin when it's been applied over something that does not stop pushing against it. He stood at her row again, and this time his arms were not crossed. They were at his sides, which was worse because it suggested he had stopped performing casualness and was simply moving toward what he had decided to do. He said he needed to see photo identification. Not the boarding pass this time, actual government-issued ID to verify the name against the ticket. He framed it as protocol, mentioned something about enhanced security requirements on transatlantic routes, kept his tone in that specific register of official inconvenience, the voice of someone doing an unpleasant thing because the rules require it, not because they want to, and isn't that a shame for everyone? Naomi considered her options with the rapid, quiet efficiency of someone who has spent a career assessing hostile situations and selecting the response that serves the largest number of objectives simultaneously. She could show the badge now and end it, but she did not want to end it yet because ending it now would let him claim it was a misunderstanding, a protocol error, nothing more. She needed the record to be longer. She needed witnesses whose memories were saturated with specifics, so she reached into her bag, past the concealed badge, past the encrypted drive labeled in code she was not going to explain to Derek Holt, and found her wallet, and from the wallet she withdrew her New York State driver's license and handed it across. She expected this to end it. Not because she was naive. Naomi Ellison had not been naive about how the world worked since she was approximately 8 years old, but because the thing she was handing him was a legitimate government document bearing her photograph and her name and her address, and even a man determined to find a reason to doubt her should have run out of reasons at that point. He held it up to the overhead light. He turned it over. He squinted at it, actually squinted as though she were presenting him with a forged Rembrandt rather than a standard-issue state ID that could be verified in approximately 15 seconds with any smartphone. He muttered something about the lamination. He turned it over again, and then he leaned slightly forward, not enough to crowd her, but enough to close the distance in a way that was deliberately physical, deliberately designed to communicate something about who had the power in this exchange. And he said, in a voice pitched low enough to be intimate, but not low enough to be private, the thing that he had clearly been working his way toward since he walked into this cabin and found her in seat 4A. He said that a pretty face and a confident manner could only get a person so far. He said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing with a practiced casualness that is supposed to make it land like an observation rather than an attack. He said that people dressed up acted the part, tried on things they hadn't actually earned, and it was understandable really wanting a taste of the life you saw other people living. He said it quietly, but not so quietly that Gale, standing 3 feet away in the galley entrance, could not hear every word. Not so quietly that the passenger in 3B, who had been pretending to be asleep for the last 10 minutes, could not hear it. Not so quietly that Caleb in 5B, leaning slightly into the aisle with the unself-conscious attentiveness of a child, could not hear it. The cabin did not react with noise. It reacted with the specific silence of people who have just heard something they cannot pretend they did not hear and are in the process of deciding what to do with that. Gale had gone completely still. Owen Hurst had lowered his glass to the tray table. The woman in pearls was looking at the back of the seat in front of her with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to remain neutral. Naomi's blood was iron in her veins, cold and exact, and she held the quality of her breath and the quality of her expression at exactly the same pitch, which took the kind of effort that does not show because it has been refined over years into something that looks like stillness. She opened her mouth not to argue. Arguing was not what this was, but to close it cleanly and finally. "Captain Holt," she said in a voice so composed that it was its own kind of pressure. "Return my identification to me now." He looked at her for a half-second, and in that half-second she could see the calculation, the weighing of options, the assessment of risk, the conclusion that a man in his position in his cabin had nothing to fear from the woman sitting in seat 4A. His pride came back like an undertow pulling against the surface of his composure, and he smiled the smile of someone who has decided they've already won, and he said he didn't think so. He said the lamination was peeling and the card felt flimsy and he'd need to hold on to it until they landed and could verify it properly with airport security. And then, while Naomi watched and could not stop it because stopping it would have required a speed and a force that would have served no one, he bent the license between his thumb and forefinger just slightly at first, testing feeling for resistance, and then more until the plastic cracked with a sound that was not loud but that carried through the first-class cabin with the particular acoustics of something irreversible. He dropped the two halves onto her tray table. The pieces landed face up, her photograph staring back at her from the left half, her name bisected cleanly across the break. He said, problem solved in the tone of a man closing a file, and turned on his heel and walked toward the cockpit with the unhurried stride of authority restored, leaving her sitting with the wreckage of a government document in her lap and the weight of 24 witnesses who had just watched it happen. The cabin did not gasp. It went the other kind of quiet. The kind that is actually louder, the kind that presses against the ears, the kind that means every person in the room is processing the same thing at the same time, and none of them has found the words for it yet. Caleb made a small sound, not a word, not a cry, just a brief, involuntary exhalation, the sound of a child who has seen something they know is wrong and whose body registers it before their mind catches up. Owen Hurst looked at him and then looked away quickly in the direction of the window as though the darkness outside the aircraft were suddenly very important. Naomi looked at the two pieces of her license on the tray table. She placed them side by side carefully with the tips of two fingers aligning them the way you'd align something you were not finished with something you were keeping, because she was keeping it. It was evidence now, and she knew exactly what it was evidence of and exactly what she was going to do with it. Gale appeared at her side, not performing service, not managing the situation on behalf of the airline, but simply present as a woman who had reached the limit of what she could pretend not to have seen. She asked quietly if she might take the pieces. Naomi nodded. Gale sealed them in a small bag with the slow deliberateness of someone handling something that matters, and she did it without being asked to, and that choice was its own kind of statement. And then from 5B, a voice, small, careful, containing none of the social inhibitions that would have stopped an adult from speaking. "Are you okay?" Caleb, leaning into the aisle, his notebook held against his chest, watching her with the direct, serious concern of a child who has not yet learned that some situations require you to look away. Naomi looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not softness exactly, but the particular kind of opening that happens when a person who has been entirely alone in a difficult moment realizes suddenly that they are not. She told him yes. She told him she was going to be just fine. And then, with the quiet deliberateness of a woman who has decided that the hour has arrived, she stood. The movement was unhurried, and that was the thing people would remember later. Not the badge, not the words, not the expression on Derek Holt's face when he finally understood what was happening, but the specific quality of stillness contained in the act of standing up the way Naomi rose from seat 4. Without haste or drama or any of the emotional acceleration the moment seemed to demand, as though she were simply choosing to be vertical now, as though this were a decision, with exactly the same weight as every other decision she had made on this flight, when in fact it was the decision the whole flight had been building toward. The book was still open on her tray table, the underlined passage visible to anyone standing close enough to read it. You have power over your mind, not outside events. And she left it there deliberately because she was going to come back to it, and because something about the sight of it felt important. In a way she couldn't fully articulate, but trusted anyway, the way she trusted all the things her training had made instinctive. She reached into her bag with her left hand, not quickly, not with the performative slowness of someone making a show of their own restraint, but with the natural pace of a person who knows exactly what they are reaching for, and exactly where it is, and has no reason to rush. Her fingers found the leather case tucked between a tube of lip balm and a travel-sized bottle of ibuprofen in the inside pocket where she always kept it, and she withdrew it, and she held it in her open palm, and she opened it with one thumb. The gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the overhead lighting of Liberty Cross Flight 441's first-class cabin and held it the eagle, the seal, the credential card with her photograph, and beneath it in clean, unambiguous block letters, Special Agent. It was not large, it was not dramatic. It was simply a fact about the world held out in a woman's open hand so that the world could see it clearly. For a moment, no one in the cabin made a sound. Then the sounds came carefully and separately, a soft intake of breath from somewhere near the rear of first class. A quiet thud as the businessman's laptop met the tray table. The crystalline tap of Owen Hurst's glass being set down on a hard surface for the second time in 10 minutes. The woman in pearls turned from the window. Gale in the galley entrance pressed one hand flat against the partition, and in 5B Caleb, who had been holding his notebook against his chest since the sound of the cracking plastic, looked at the badge with his mouth slightly open and his pencil hanging forgotten from his fingers. And then he looked down at the drawing on his lap, at the figure he had sketched in seat 4A with a book on her knees, and something resolved in his face that had not been resolved before the expression of a child who has just understood something important that they had sensed without understanding. And his pencil found the page again, and he began to draw with a new, purposeful intensity. When Naomi spoke, the cabin heard her voice the way you hear something that has been calibrated to carry, not loud, not amplified, not requiring any of the performances of volume that people mistake for authority, but steady and complete the voice of someone who has spent years learning the difference between speaking and being heard, and has arrived at a mastery of the latter. She identified herself. Special Agent Dr. Naomi Ellison, Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently assigned to a classified field operation with an active transatlantic component. She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without emphasis in the wrong places, every word carrying exactly the weight it needed to carry and no more. She stated what had occurred on this flight clearly and in sequence because she was a federal agent, and a federal agent documents she had been questioned without cause, subjected to repeated demands for identification that were not standard procedure, made to hear her right to occupy her seat publicly questioned by the commanding officer of this aircraft, and had her government-issued identification deliberately destroyed in front of multiple witnesses. She said that the destruction of a federal agent's credentials is a federal offense. She said it without heat. She turned toward the cockpit. Not quickly, not aggressively, she moved the way she had moved since she stood up with the unhurried absolute certainty of someone who has not been stopped by anything that has happened so far and does not expect to be stopped now. First Officer Ray Solis was standing in the partition area between the galley and the cockpit entrance. He had heard everything, had heard more than everything had been hearing. Captain Derek Holt's decisions accumulate in this cabin since the aircraft taxied from the gate. And now he stood very still with the expression of a man who is in the process of discovering where the line is, and finding that he has been standing on the wrong side of it. Naomi looked at him directly. She cited the federal statute Title 49 of the United States Code, the provision governing federal agents' authority aboard commercial aircraft. She informed him formally and by name that she was relieving Captain Derek Holt of operational command, citing interference with a federal agent and compromise of flight security effective immediately. She told him that Holt was not to approach the controls, issue crew directives, or communicate with air traffic control for the remainder of the flight. She told him that he was, as of this moment, the acting captain of Liberty Cross Flight 441. Ray Solis was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And it was quiet, but it was firm, and it was the sound of a man landing on the right side of a line he had been approaching for longer than today. The cabin absorbed this. It did not erupt, it did the opposite. It deepened it, became more still the way deep water is more still than shallow water. The stillness of something with significant weight behind it, Inside the cockpit, Derek Holt had heard it all. The door was not perfectly soundproofed, and even if it had been the quality of the silence on the other side of it, would have been enough to tell him that something irreversible was happening. He sat in the pilot's seat for 45 seconds, which is a long time to sit in a seat while your professional life restructures itself around you, and then he opened the cockpit door. He stood in the doorway of the cabin that had been his domain for 2 decades of flying, and he looked out at it, and what he saw was this Naomi Ellison standing in the aisle with her badge in her open hand, and Ray Solis nodding beside her, and every passenger in first class looking at him not with anger, not with excitement, but with the specific level attention of witnesses, which is a different thing entirely and is in its own way the most difficult thing to face. He opened his mouth. The words came out wrong. The cadence was off the authority hollow like an instrument that looks intact but produces no sound because the mechanism inside it has stopped working. He said something about his cabin, about his command, about this being a misunderstanding, and none of it connected to anything solid because the solid things were gone. Owen Hurst in seat 3. Hay did not make any sound this time. He looked at Holt directly for the first time since the captain had come to greet him by name before takeoff, and what was in Owen's face was not satisfaction, and was not sympathy. It was the expression of a man who is slowly and uncomfortably understanding his own position in something which is a reckoning of a different kind from Holt's, but a reckoning nonetheless. In 5B, Caleb watched with his pencil moving steadily across a new page in his notebook. Not the careful exploratory drawing of earlier, but something more purposeful, more certain, the drawing of someone who knows what they are drawing, and why. He was drawing the moment as it was happening, which is what witnesses do, which is what artists do, which is what 10-year-old boys with spiral notebooks do when they feel that something is important enough to keep. Gale took 3 steps forward, not dramatically, not announcing the movement as anything other than what it was, but she stepped from the galley entrance into the aisle and stood there, which put her body in the same physical territory as Naomi's, which was a choice, and the cabin read it for exactly what it was. She had chosen. It had cost her something to choose it, and she had chosen anyway. Holt looked at Gale. Something crossed his face that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but was somewhere between them the specific experience of seeing a person you believed was on your side, standing somewhere else. He looked at Naomi one more time, and then he retreated into the cockpit, and the door closed, and the first-class cabin of Liberty Cross Flight 441 took a long collective breath. Naomi returned to her seat. She sat crossed her legs and reached for her book. The underlined passage was where she had left it. She read it again. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Then she turned the page. She did not take a victory lap. She did not look around the cabin to measure the weight of what had just happened in other people's faces, or allow herself the small human satisfaction of watching the room reorganize itself around a new reality. She sat and she breathed and she opened her book and she existed in the space of what she had just done with the same quality of presence she had brought to every other moment on this flight, not performing composure, but actually possessing it, which is different, and which is the harder thing. The first-class cabin transformed around her in the way that a room transforms after lightning. The charge has not left, but it has changed form, dispersed into something that saturates the air, rather than concentrating in a single visible point. The passengers who had been pretending not to see now studied their own hands or the backs of the seats in front of them, or the darkness through the oval windows, engaged in the private activity of people who are reconsidering things. Owen Hurst ordered nothing from Gale when she passed. The woman in pearls sat with her eye mask in her hands, not wearing it, not setting it down, just holding it. The businessman had opened his laptop again, but was not typing. Gale brought Naomi a glass of water without being asked. She set it down on the tray table beside the book with a quiet precision, and did not say anything, just looked at Naomi for a brief moment with an expression that contained several things that were not easy to put into words. And then she straightened and moved on, and Naomi said, "Thank you, Gail, for the second time that night." And the second time landed differently than the first, which is the way gratitude works when it is real. She retrieved a slim satellite phone from the interior pocket of her bag and moved to the rear of the first-class section near the partition where she could speak without being easily overheard. The call was brief and coded. She identified the flight and her position, confirmed the mission timeline was intact, reported the interference and its resolution, requested ground coordination at Heathrow law enforcement presence at an isolated stand, Customs Notification Standard Protocol for an incident involving a federal agent. She did not editorialize. She did not describe what had happened in any of the language it deserved. She gave the operational facts and clicked the phone shut and returned to her seat. Outside the windows, the Atlantic was black and absolute, no landmarks, no lights, no evidence that the world below the surface of the water had anything to do with the world above it. The aircraft moved through the darkness at 500 miles an hour, and the stars through the glass were cold and indifferent, and Naomi sat beneath them and thought about her mother. Not the hospital story, she had thought about the hospital story enough for one flight, but about the version of her mother that came after it. The version who walked out of that Baltimore admissions desk still in labor back straight, and went to a different hospital, and delivered her daughter, and raised her in a house where the word impossible was used primarily as a way of identifying the next thing that needed to be done. That was the inheritance. Not just the wound, but the posture. Not just the knowledge of how the world could treat you, but the absolute refusal to be made smaller by it than you actually were. She turned a page. The aircraft hummed around her steady and indifferent, carrying them all toward London. Gail made her way quietly to row 5 during a lull in the service, crouching beside Caleb's seat with the easy warmth she had deployed when they first boarded. Though there was something different in it now, more careful, more attentive. The warmth of a woman who has been through something alongside this child and is checking whether he weathered it. He had. Caleb was sitting with his notebook open and his pencil moving, and when Gail asked how he was doing, he looked up at her with the clear eyes of a child who has processed something difficult and come out the other side with it organized rather than scattered. He said he was okay. He said the man was mean. Gail said yes, he was. Caleb said the woman was brave. Gail agreed quietly that yes, she was. He showed Gail what he had been drawing, turning the notebook around so she could see the pages he had filled during the flight. And what Gail saw was a visual record of everything that had occurred in first class since takeoff, rendered in pencil by a 10-year-old with a sketchbook, and the unself-conscious accuracy of a child who draws what he actually sees rather than what he thinks he's supposed to see. The cabin from the angle of 5B, the figure in seat 4, A with a book on her knees, the man with the pale, straight hair standing over her hand extended, holding something that on closer inspection was clearly a card, a driver's license, the shape unmistakable even at a child's scale. The card in 2 pieces. And then on the final page, half finished when Gail looked at it, the woman standing the gold shape in her open hand, every line of the figure drawn with the particular confidence of someone who had finally understood what they were looking at. Gail held the notebook for a long moment. Then she asked Caleb whether she could show it to someone. He asked who. She told him the woman from seat 4A. He said okay, and added with the specific precision of a child who has decided something that she should keep it. She could have it. Gail brought the notebook to Naomi and laid it open on her tray table without explanation, and Naomi looked at it. Looked at all of it. The sequence of pages, the careful record kept by a child who had no reason to keep it, except that it had seemed important, and she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Gail gently stepped back to give her the space the moment required. Then Naomi stood and walked back to row 5 and crouched beside Caleb's seat, bringing herself level with him the way adults do when they want a child to understand that they are being spoken to directly, not managed or placated. She asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He didn't hesitate, because children who know the answer to something say it immediately without the performance of consideration that adults have learned to insert before their real answers. He said he wanted to be someone who didn't let people get away with being mean to others. He said it simply as though it were obvious, as though it were the only reasonable ambition for a person to have. Naomi was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression during that moment was not entirely controlled, not a loss of composure, but a very slight, very human softening, the kind that happens when something outside you connects with something you have been carrying alone for a long time. Then she told him he already was. She stood. She went back to seat 4A. She picked up her book. In the cockpit, Ray Solis flew Liberty Cross Flight 441 toward London with steady hands and level instruments, and behind him, in the jump seat, Derek Holt sat with his harness buckled and his platinum blonde hair still precisely combed, because the body maintains its habits even when everything else has stopped working. He was not speaking. He had stopped trying to speak 20 minutes ago. The silence had weight, the particular weight of a man understanding the distance between where he is and where he thought he was, and finding the gap immeasurable. With approximately an hour remaining before Heathrow, Owen Hurst did something that no one in the first-class cabin of Liberty Cross Flight 441 expected, including Naomi, suspected Owen Hurst himself. He unbuckled his seatbelt, rose from seat 3. Crossed the aisle and lowered himself into the empty seat beside her, with the careful, deliberate movements of a large man who is trying very hard not to seem threatening, which is its own kind of information. He did not perform contrition. He did not arrive with the fluent, practiced apology of someone who has had to apologize publicly before and has developed a method for it, the kind of apology that is really a form of damage control, wearing the clothes of remorse. He sat with his big hands on his knees, and he said something quiet and imperfect and real, that he had heard something earlier that he should not have let pass without reaction, and he had let it pass, and he had made a sound that was even worse than silence. And he had been sitting with that for the last hour, thinking about what kind of person makes that sound and why, and he didn't have a good answer. Naomi listened. She did not accept the apology or reject it or respond to it with any of the performed graciousness that would have made it easier for him. She simply let him finish, and then she asked him one question in the same even tone she used for everything, whether he would have made that sound if it had been the boy in row 5 being questioned. Owen was quiet for a considerable time. The question sat between them in the space over the Atlantic 37,000 feet above the surface of the water, and it did not dissolve or soften while it sat there. It simply waited. The way real questions wait, with the patience of things that don't need an answer to be true. He returned to his seat eventually without having answered aloud, but the fact of his silence was its own answer, and they both understood that. He paused at row 5 on his way back. Caleb looked up at him with the frank, uncomplicated attention of a child who has no reason to perform anything, and Owen asked him what he was drawing. Caleb showed him, turned the notebook to the page he'd been working on. Before Gale came the one with the figure in the suit in seat 3, a slightly turned-away glass in hand. Owen looked at it for a long time. He did not ask Caleb to change it. He straightened, returned to seat 3A, and did not touch his bourbon for the rest of the flight. This was what reckonings actually looked like. Naomi thought, watching from seat 4A, not the dramatic collapse, not the loud and public repentance, but this, a man sitting with an accurate drawing of himself and choosing not to dispute it. She had spent her career believing that justice required institutions and statutes and official records, all of which were true, and all of which she had invoked tonight. but she had occasionally underestimated the justice that was available through simpler means: a child's pencil, an honest question, the willingness to look at something clearly. 40 minutes from Heathrow, the cockpit door opened one final time, and Derek Holt emerged, not with authority, not with the posture of a commanding officer, but with the careful, diminished movements of a man who knows the territory has changed and is crossing it anyway, because he cannot stop himself, because pride is the last thing to go, and it goes badly when it goes. He stood in the aisle. His platinum blonde hair was still impeccably combed. His uniform was still immaculate. The body had maintained all the forms while the substance had evacuated them, and the result was a man who looked from a certain angle like authority, but who, from the angle Naomi was watching from, looked like a costume. He looked at her, and what was in his face now had nothing in it of the condescension or the calculation of earlier. Those were gone along with the confidence that had animated them. What remained was something smaller and rawer, a man who had just spent 40 minutes in a cockpit jump seat understanding what he had done and asking himself whether there was a version of this that ended differently, and arriving at the answer that there was not, and finding that difficult to sit with. He said a few things. He said the word mistake more than once. Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting, and then she said two things back to him, and she said them without coldness, without the gratifying edge that contempt would have added, because contempt was not what this was about, and she had never confused justice with revenge. She told him that he had not made a mistake. A mistake is what you make when you act without intention, and everything he had done on this flight had been intentional step by deliberate step, each one a choice. And she told him that choices have weight, and that she intended to make sure his carried exactly the weight it should in official reports and formal proceedings, and all the subsequent channels that she had spent the last hour putting into motion. She said it without satisfaction. It was not about satisfaction, it was about accuracy. He went back to the cockpit. The door closed. Gale from the galley let out a long and careful breath. The breath of a woman who has been holding something in a closed hand for several hours and has finally been permitted to open it. She looked at Naomi across the aisle, and Naomi looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say that the flight had not already said. The descent began over the English Channel, and the aircraft dropped through layers of cloud that dissolved the stars one by one until there was only the gray of high-altitude moisture, and then below that, the amber sprawl of London coming into view through the oval windows, bridges lit against the Thames, the geometry of streets and roundabouts, the distant blink of Heathrow's perimeter lights approaching with the slow, inevitable gravity of something that has been waiting. The wheels met the runway with a gentleness that belonged to a different kind of flight, a routine arrival, an unremarkable landing, the kind that no one remembers. But this landing was not that, and as the engines wound down from their landing roar to the lower pitch of ground roll, the first-class cabin was very quiet in the way of people who understand that what comes next is not the ordinary choreography of disembarkation. Instead of turning toward the terminal, the aircraft followed a pulsing yellow follow-me vehicle that led them to a remote stand on the far side of the airfield away from the gates and the arrivals hall and the ordinary business of a Tuesday evening at Heathrow. The passengers in first class pressed to the windows and saw what was waiting there in the sodium-lit air of the tarmac. 2 black sedans, a dark vehicle bearing a government emblem on its door, and 4 figures in dark coats standing in the particular still formation of people with a specific and official purpose. The engines went quiet. The parking brake engaged with a clean final click. In the hush that followed, the cabin held itself like a held breath. Caleb in 5B looked out his window at the figures on the tarmac and asked Gale, who had come to stand near his row, what those people were there for. Gale crouched beside him and told him the truth in the plain language that children deserve and rarely get. They were there to make sure everything was handled properly. that the right thing happened to the right people, that the night ended the way it was supposed to end. Caleb looked at the figures for another moment and then nodded, the nod of a child who finds this satisfying in a deep and uncomplicated way, and closed his notebook and set his pencil on top of it and folded his hands in his lap. Naomi entered the cockpit for the final time, and the room contracted around her presence in the way that rooms contract when someone enters them with complete authority, not performed, not asserted, simply real. The authority of a person who has been exactly right about everything, and knows it, and does not need it acknowledged. Holt was still in the jump seat. He had not moved. The harness was buckled across his chest, and his hands were on his knees, and his platinum blonde hair was still perfectly combed, the last detail of a performance that had ended some time ago. The body maintaining its grooming habits after the person inside has stopped trying. He looked up at her, and there was nothing left of what he had brought to this flight. No condescension, no calculation, no institutional confidence, just a man in a uniform that no longer fit the person wearing it who had spent the last 40 minutes understanding the precise dimensions of what he had done. She told him to exit the aircraft. She said there would be no handcuffs here. Those came later through the proper channels, which were already in motion. But she wanted him to walk out through the first-class cabin under his own power, through the aisle he had walked through with ownership and ease, when this flight began in front of the same passengers who had watched him decide what kind of person Naomi Ellison was, and act on that decision. She said it without cruelty. It was simply the most accurate conclusion to what had happened on this flight. He stood. He walked into the first-class aisle. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes followed him from the cockpit door to the forward exit. Owen Hurst, who had made a sound at the wrong moment and had been sitting with it for hours, looked at Holt directly and did not look away, which was a form of courage that cost him something, even if no one would ever know about it. The woman in pearls, who had spent the flight looking at the seat back in front of her, looked at him now with an expression that was complicated and honest. The businessman watched over the top of his closed laptop. Caleb in 5B held his closed notebook in both hands. He did not draw this part. There are things you keep in memory rather than on paper, things where the image is important enough that you don't want it mediated by a pencil. And this was one of them, the man with the pale straight hair walking through the aisle he had owned smaller than he had been carrying what he had chosen. Holt descended the aircraft stairs to the tarmac. The officials were waiting. One of them placed a hand at his elbow, not roughly, simply with the matter-of-fact physical direction of official procedure. A car door opened. He paused at the threshold, and in that pause, he looked up at the aircraft, and at the top of the stairs in the open doorway Naomi was standing. She looked back at him. She did not speak. She did not need to. He got in the car. The door closed with the sound of something that has been decided. Naomi turned and walked back through the cabin for the last time, collecting her bag from seat 4A, her book on top of it, the pages no longer open to any particular passage. Gail was at the cabin door, and when Naomi reached her, the flight attendant said 3 words in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Agent Ellison." Naomi stopped. She looked at Gail for a moment with the full attention of a person choosing to be present for something. Then she said, "You moved first." She descended the stairs into the cold London air, the last passenger off the aircraft, and the night received her without ceremony. 6 weeks later, Naomi arrived at her Washington field office before 6 in the morning, which she did most days because the building was quiet before 6, and the quiet was useful for thinking, and she had a great deal to think about in the months after London. The case files were already open on her desk when the morning mail arrived, forwarded through the Bureau's routing system, and among the official correspondence was a padded envelope with no return address, just a name printed carefully in the handwriting of someone who had clearly been taught to print by someone who cared about legibility. Inside was a spiral notebook, and clipped to the front cover was a note on lined paper. "I finished the drawing. You can have it. Naomi opened the notebook to the final page, and what she found was a drawing she had not seen completed before the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight rendered in pencil with the precise, unsentimental accuracy of a child who draws only what is actually there, and in the center of it, a woman standing in the aisle with something gold in her open hand, and the light in the drawing coming from that gold shape radiating outward into the cabin, reaching the edges of the page. Beneath the drawing in the same careful hand, "I didn't know people like you existed. Now I know what I want to be. Caleb." Naomi set the notebook beside her coffee cup. She did not put it in a drawer. She left it open on the desk where she could see it, and she went back to work. The changes at Liberty Cross Airlines were announced 3 weeks after Naomi's report was formally submitted. Not because of public pressure, though the pressure came, and it came hard because 3 members of Liberty Cross's own board of directors had been in first class on Flight 441 and had filed their own accounts before the aircraft's engines were cold. Captain Derek Holt's license was suspended pending federal investigation. Gail Foster was promoted to head of cabin operations and given authority to design the new crew conduct training from scratch, a task she approached with the seriousness and the specificity of someone who had a great deal of material to work from. Ray Solis was named Liberty Cross's youngest senior captain, and Owen Hurst, who would never discuss publicly what had happened on that flight, quietly established a fund in his late wife's name that provided scholarships for first-generation law students. Not a grand gesture, not a press release. Just an account that got funded every year without announcement because some reckonings are private. Naomi boarded her next assignment 48 hours after the notebook arrived. Different airline, different city, the same worn meditations in her bag, the same encrypted drive in the inner pocket, the same badge in its leather case 2 inches below that. She found her seat, stowed her bag, and sat down. She did not open the book. She looked out the window at the tarmac moving past at the ordinary machinery of an airport, going about its ordinary business ground crews and luggage carts, and the small orange wands of the ground marshalers guiding aircraft through the gray morning. And she thought about a boy who had drawn what he saw because no one had told him not to, because the truth had seemed important enough to keep on paper, because he was 10 years old and he already knew what he wanted to be. She thought about her mother who had walked out of a Baltimore hospital still in labor with her back straight and her dignity intact, and gone to another hospital and delivered her daughter, and raised her in a house where impossible was a word that meant next. And she thought, this is what it costs, and this is why it's worth it, and the cost does not go away, and neither does the worth. The aircraft began to move. She was ready. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity is not a privilege but a right, and that quiet strength is its own kind of power, subscribe to our channel because the stories that matter most are the ones we keep telling until the world is ready to hear them.